Ambassador Fernando Remirez is a medical doctor. He holds a degree in the social sciences. He was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Federation of University Students beginning in 1976. And he was president of the Continental Association of Latin American Students from 1978 to 1981. And he served as the head of the Young Communist League's International Relations Department in Cuba, of course. He's been an officer of the International Relations Department to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba since 1991. And in 1992, was named First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has represented Cuba as their ambassador to the United Nations. Today, he is Cuba's senior diplomat in Washington. He's head of the Cuban Interest section, which of course is located in the Swiss Embassy. He holds the rank of ambassador, of course. As I've said, he is the first deputy foreign minister. I look forward with the greatest of interest to what he will have to say this evening, and it's my enormous pleasure to present to you Ambassador Fernando Remirez.
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the sponsors of this event for inviting us to be here today. Your decision to organize this conference is a testimony of good feelings and interest in my country. At the same time, I'm very pleased to visit this beautiful and vigorous city of Baltimore, known not only for the Orioles. I'm Cuban, you know what we feel about baseball, but also because of its history and its significant contributions to the United States and the world. I have been asked to speak about my country. As you may know, after the disappearance of the former Soviet Union 5 years ago, many persons predict the collapse of the Cuban economy and along with it, the end of our revolution. Really, by 1993, the economic outlook of Cuba was very unfavorable. The gross domestic product had decreased almost 35% in regards to 1989. Imports had fallen 75%, and the state budget deficit reached 33% of that gross domestic product. However, against all the predictions, 3 years afterwards, the situation experienced an encouraging change, and at present the Cuban economy shows its first signs of recovery. Let me give you some information and data regarding this. A group of measures were adopted internally in order to increase the efficiency and competitiveness of our economy. In this way, the reform of wholesale prices was introduced in 1992 with the objective of considering the real cost in the prices and eliminate progressively the subsidy to the producers. In 1993, Cubans were authorized to hold foreign currencies. Also, self-employment was legalized and new jobs have been authorized. At present, 200,000 Cubans have their own working license. It has been estimated that a similar figure is also working without a license. In this regard, our goal is to legalize their status as self-employed so that they could pay their taxes. The pattern of land tenancy has changed in these 2 years, and cooperative farms have been created. These farms cover 67% of the land that was previously managed by the state, compared to 12% in 1992. So the current figures show that the state administers only the 33% of the agricultural lands, compared to a 75% in 1992. And the private and cooperative sectors have a 67% compared to a 24% 3 years ago. So, for the first time in almost 35 years, people are returning to the countryside to till the land, to work in the agriculture. Some 43,000 hectares of land for coffee production have been handed over to more than 8,000 people. Around 25,000 hectares of land for tobacco cultivation have been handed over to more than 11,000 people. And 5,000 hectares have been turned over to 22,000 people to produce other crops. In 1994, the central government was reduced and a law of the tax system was adopted with the purpose of balancing the state budget and contributing to the efficiency of the economy. Farmer and industrial markets were also created. As a result of these measures, in 1994, the Cuban economy increased in a 0.7%. 0.7% in 1994. This meant a change in the decreasing tendency in the last years. In 1995, this favorable trend was confirmed with a growth of 2.5%. For 1996, we're expecting a growth of a 4 to 5%, and actually, in this first quarter, a 7% was obtained, which is an expression of the country's capacity to recover. There is a revival in almost all the sectors, including the sugar harvest that has recovered, and until last week, the production has reached 4.3 million tons. That is 1 more million than last year, when Cuba had one of the worst harvests. Nickel production grew in 74% last year, supported by an increase in the world market prices. In 1995, tourism surpassed sugar production as Cuba's first economic sector and reached in 1995 more than $1 billion of gross revenues. There are currently 25,000 rooms in 159 facilities. We had 745,000 visitors in 1995 compared to about 600,000 the previous year, and we're expecting over 900,000 for this year. The tourist sector had an average increase of 20% in the last 5 years. This is a clear demonstration about the potentialities of this sector in Cuba. Tobacco production increased almost 60% last year, and the fishing industry 14%. Crude oil production grew 18%, and we reached for the first time 1.4 million tons last year. Steel industry also increased its production by 42%. Fertilizers doubled, and cement production grew in 32%. The agricultural production has also increased in 30%, and we saw a tendency to stabilize more the labor force, although, of course, this does not mean that the food needs of the Cuban population are satisfied. At the same time, there has been a decrease of 10% of the prices in the farmers' market. Regarding other economic indicators, let me tell you that the budget deficit was 5 billion pesos or dollars in 1993. That represents, as I said at the beginning, a third, 33%, of the domestic gross product at current prices that year. In 1994, our economy managed to cut the deficit in 72%. In 1995, the deficit was only 850 million pesos or dollars. In 1996, we are planning to close with a deficit of 775 million pesos or dollars, approximately 4% of the domestic gross product. And for 2 more years, we have the plan to have a balanced budget. Maybe it sounds familiar to you. It means that we reduced the public deficit in almost 85% in only 2 years. In September 1995, the Cuban Parliament passed a new law of foreign investment, finishing a process that began with the amendment to our Constitution in its Article 23, by which the reversible character of state-owned property was modified. And at the same time, the property of joint venture and economic associations on their asset was stated. This law gives legal support to more than 200 economic associations involved in 34 branches of the economy, with the capital resources from more than 50 countries that represent an investment higher than $2.2 billion, figure that it is not enough, but very encouraging. It has been possible to reorient our foreign trade. Now, the European Union is our most important partner, covering the third part of the total exchange in 1994. The economic relations have acquired a significant dimension with Latin America and the Caribbean, that have become the second commercial partners. Our economic relations have also widened with Canada, Asia, Africa, and Australia. It is not our intention to overestimate or magnify the present economic recovery in my country. On the contrary, we know that hardships and difficulties still persist. But allow me to state that all these encouraging results have been achieved keeping very favorable levels in healthcare, education, and social security. It is worthwhile telling you that these three sectors represent the 32% of the state budget last year and are compared to, I repeat, 32% of the budget last year was for healthcare, education, and social security, compared to the 5.7% of the one dedicated to defense, which has been reduced during the last 5 years in a 50%. Our government has made all these economic adjustments, always trying to keep the social development. On the subject of employment, we have been carrying out a process of rationalization of the workforce, but we want to do it gradually and certainly not in an uncontrolled way. We applied a resolution that established that workers will be paid 60% of their wages than they are not needed in their jobs. Only 11,000 workers are now receiving this subsidy of over 100,000 to which it was previously applied. On the other hand, for our economic future, we also have to consider that Cuba is a country with a quite developed infrastructure, with 10,000 miles of highways, almost 4,000 miles of railways, a complete net of warehouses, 7 international airports, 7 main ports, and the most important thing, a qualified labor force, because not only illiteracy was eliminated, but at the same time, the average educational level is 10th grade. There are more than 550,000 university graduates, with 46 universities and colleges and 118 scientific and research centers. In Cuba, a healthcare system deemed as unique for Latin America and covering the whole country is available. Medical services are free for all Cubans. In 1995, Cuba showed the lowest infant mortality rate for Latin America and one of the lowest worldwide, 9.4 per 1,000 live births. Life expectancy is 75.2 years. The only problem that we have with life expectancy is that women live 3 more years than men. They are stronger, in our opinion. We have 63,000 physicians and 22,000 family doctors take care of 90% of the population. In addition, there are 435 clinics and 278 hospitals. In sports, Cuba won the 5th place in all-around in the last Olympic Games, and we expect to maintain our position within the first 6 places in Atlanta. We have already sent more than 400 sports teams through the world in preparation for the Olympic Games. Allow me to state that my country is also undertaking a new policy towards Cubans living abroad that includes the Cuban American community. I'm normalizing the relation with Cuba. That new policy not only gives the possibility to the Cubans living abroad to participate in the new investment process in the countries, as well as the increase of visits to Cuba, including a free access to enter the country. In foreign relations, Cuba has traveled the international official links we had in 1959, when there was diplomatic ties with 51 states. Today, Cuba maintains diplomatic links with 157 countries. From 1989 to 1996, Cuba established diplomatic relations with 34 nations, and the links with other countries have been increased. Out of the 185 United Nations states, 81 have diplomatic missions accredited in Havana, and Cuba has 89 embassies and 19 consulates abroad. And there are important trade and cooperation relations with more than 125 nations. Last year, Cuba joined the Caribbean States Association, and it also signed the Tlatelolco Treaty on the proscription of nuclear weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. Moreover, Cuba has signed agreements of investment, protection, and promotion with 11 countries. Last was Germany last week. As you see, Cuba is making headway in its opening to the world through trade and investment, despite the U.S. embargo, and it has proved to be able to cope effectively with the new challenge. It is in this context that the Helms-Burton legislation was approved. The goal of this law is to bring down the Cuban government by punishing U.S. allies and trading partners engaged in economic transactions with Cuba, thus reinforcing the economic and commercial embargo imposed against Cuba. This goal has been a recurrent theme in the U.S. policy toward Cuba since 1959. This is nothing new, and such attempts have failed and will continue to fail. This law is not only contrary to the principles of international law and to the major international agreements that the United States has signed, but it is also, in our opinion, a massive intrusion into Cuba's internal affairs. It pretends to benefit, in the first place, those who were deeply engaged in the Batista dictatorship, those that we call Batistianos. Its effects will be certainly counterproductive. It will isolate, in our opinion, the U.S. policy toward Cuba even further in the international community. It will create frictions among the U.S. and its economic and trading allies and partners. It will also unnecessarily increase hostility between Cuba and the U.S. And the most important of all, it will leave no alternative, no choice to our revolution and to our people, but to continue fighting for its self-determination and for its independence. At this point, allow me to remember some experts from an interview that was published in the United States on December 14, 1963, in the New Republic. In that occasion, it was said, and I quote, "I believe that there is no country in the world, including all the African regions, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. The end of the quote. Who said that? The deceased President John F. Kennedy said in an interview with the French journalist Jean Daniel. Nowadays, diplomacy and policy cannot be practiced by threatening families that want to meet again or businessmen and government that want to trade freely. If the U.S. truly believes in free trade and it is willing to promote business in the world, then why does it try to prevent Cuba from doing so? Why does it try to impose its rules on my country and on other nations in the world? Cuba has never been interested in creating unnecessary tension in our relations with the United States. For years, we have been promoting and we will continue to encourage exchange and contact between Cuba and the U.S. people. We Cubans will continue our endeavor to build a society of equal opportunities and social justice, without sexual or racial discrimination, and at the same time, we will continue moving forward in the economic transformation of the country. Without any doubt, Cuba is today an attractive emerging market in the Western Hemisphere, and many countries are willing to improve and expand their economic and cooperation links with Cuba. We are working hard and will continue to do so in the future with confidence and optimism. And let me state once again that we are ready to negotiate our difference with the United States because the only thing that we demand is respect for our people, our sovereignty, and our independence. Finally, we would like to thank you all for participating in this conference, in this presentation, which in our modest opinion is an example of how important it is to have a dialogue, to exchange ideas, and to work together to improve the future of our children, the future of our countries. Thank you very much once again for your attention. And once more, I thank Mr. Frank Burr, President of the Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs, for all his efforts. So now I will be pleased to answer your question. Thank you very much.
We'll have questions until 10 minutes after 7, and I'll repeat the questions after they're asked for the benefit of our television camera. Question of Mr. Savage was, in short, would you comment on what you think the future role is of Cuba in the hemisphere?
Well, first let me answer that in regards to the comparison with the Nazi Germany, Cuba and the United States, we fought together in the Second World War. We were allies. And not only in that war, that is one of the paradoxes of the current situation and the level of relation that we have now. And we are very proud, nevertheless, that we only made a very modest contribution to the effort of the Second World War and to the Second World War victory, but we participated, and we think that we participate in the right side of that war. Second, about the role of Cuba in the hemisphere, we have a very clear position to integrate Cuba to Latin America and the Caribbean, because we belong to that region, and we want to increase our economic, commercial, cultural links to our region. And we are working very hard in that direction. Fortunately, we have been welcomed by our brothers and sisters in Latin America and Caribbean. Now Cuba has diplomatic or consular relations with almost all the continent, as I said, except one country of the Caribbean we don't have diplomatic relations. We established diplomatic relations with the rest of the countries of the Caribbean. The last country that we had diplomatic relations with the region were Haiti and Dominica, that we signed a diplomatic relation during the last weeks with both of them. And we think that we have to work together and we must integrate Cuba to the region. There is no choice. We think that we are living in a different world, a very complex world, very different than the world that we knew 4 or 5 years ago during the Cold War, the so-called Cold War. And the only choice from an economic point of view is to integrate ourselves to the region. And we are in that process in a way that at the same time we want to maintain, we want to preserve the Cuban sovereignty and the Cuban independence, because that is the key point in the case of Cuba. The will of the Cuban people to maintain our independence, our sovereignty.
I know I
Thank
didn't
you.
do justice to Mr. Savage's question in full, because the analogy of Mr. Helms's remarks of yesterday was to Nazi Germany, A, a force for evil in the world, and B, an enormous power. And I don't want to expand the question by asking you to comment on Cuba as a force for evil or as a great power, but that was the edge in the question. If you'd like to add anything to your answer.
Well, of course, we don't consider ourselves as evil, first. And to be a superpower, more or less like was the Nazi Germany during the 30s and the early 40s, we want to be only a superpower in sports, particularly in baseball, is our position.
The question is, why is your government hesitant about allowing full and free elections to test the will of the people?
Well, first, I didn't say that the things were very good in Cuba. I didn't say that. Of course, that they are not good. We have many economic difficulties. We have many problems, and precisely we are trying to solve by ourselves that problem. Only that I say that, fortunately, we start a recovery of our economy 3 years ago. But of course, things are not very good. Nevertheless, that we have in healthcare, education, social security, very high standard in comparison not to the United States, who is the most powerful, the most wealthy country in the world, in comparison with the rest of Latin America and Caribbean. Because also there is a trend. Try to compare Cuba with the United States, and in our opinion, there are many differences between the two countries in size, power, economics, and many other things. Cuba belongs to Latin America and the Caribbean, as I tried to answer to the other question. That is first part. The second, we have elections. We have a political system. We have our elections in a way that we consider that they are not perfect. We have to improve. We have to perfectionate our system, no doubt. We are doing that. 3 years ago, for the first time, we direct the members of our parliament. We didn't do that before. But there is a process that we are now carry on. But in our opinion, we are not the only one who must perfectionate or improve the political system. Tell me one country who not should perfectionate or to improve the political system. That is one thing. On the other hand, the United States have relations and diplomatic relations with countries with many different political systems. And in our opinion, that is the base precisely on the international relations according to this situation. Second, you have to consider that we are carrying on that process because, as I say, we don't have a perfect society. On the contrary, we have many problems, and we must try, and we are trying to solve, and we are trying to improve the situation. But we think that we must have the right to solve the problem by ourselves. And in our opinion, the policy of the United States, the policy of embargo, the policy of aggressions, the policy of invasion, we must remember Bay of Pigs, because we suffered one invasion from the United States. Precisely 1 month ago, we commemorated the 35th anniversary of that invasion. We must remember all the attempts of assassination against our leaders that was promoted from here, from the United States. I'm not telling that. That is in the Senate and in the U.S. Congress hearings. It's something that is was discussed in the U.S. Senate and hearings. The most powerful, the biggest CIA station that in the American history was the CIA station that during the 60s was in South Florida against Cuba. And all these conditions don't help very much to improve the political system, to improve and to perfectionate our system, because we are suffering the hostile attitude for not the most powerful countries, the only superpower, and we are a very small country that we only want to fight and to preserve our independence. We make mistakes like everybody else, but we want to have the right to solve by ourselves.
The question is, the statement is that you've had an 80% increase in oil production. What do you plan to do with the proceeds?
Unfortunately, we have to use it because we would prefer to export, but there are not enough of the Cuban needs. It is true that we have a very important increase of the oil production. 5 years ago, the production was 800,000 tons, and as I said in my words, last year was 1.4 million tons.
Are you a member of OPEC?
No, we are not exporting oil. The Cuban needs are 7 million. We must import the difference.
Would you care to comment on the link between the domestic politics and the Cuban-American vote on one hand and the embargo on the other?
Well, you say that, madam. I don't want to interfere in the U.S. domestic policy, but you say that. That is the opinion of many here in the United States. I only can tell you that in our intersection in Washington, the members of our staff, we are traveled to a group of cities, to a group of different places here in the United States. And nevertheless, that of course, we don't have the same opinion in everything, but we must not have the same opinion in something that maybe we learned, but we found always a very friendly welcome, a very friendly reception, and any kind of hostile attitude we didn't find in any of our visits to all America.
The question was, would you give us a frank assessment of what you think are your worst problems in Cuba?
The economy of Cuba, because precisely for the U.S. policy at the beginning of the 60s, when the embargo started, we didn't have any other choice at that moment to establish a very close links with the former Soviet Union, with the former socialist country of East Europe. We thank and we appreciate very much the help and the support that we received during the 60s and the 70s from the former Soviet Union. And now it's something that we want to clarify. We appreciate very much that support. We will never regret for that. But for that reason, during all this year, we established a very close relation with those countries, and almost 85% of our economic links were with precisely those countries. And during the early 90s, the 1990, 1991, all these links disappeared almost overnight. And we had to establish a new relationship with the rest of the world that was precisely that I explained. And we are a country with many economic difficulties, with many economic problems, but with a different approach. Because nevertheless, the problems that we have, there are many, but we have in healthcare, in education, in social security, the situation that I explained. Because nevertheless, the problems that we had, we didn't close one school, we didn't close one hospital. On the contrary, we are trying to maintain all open, giving service to the whole population. And for that reason, we have that results. Also, in the case of the elderly population, we received many proposals to try to cut the aid, the support that we give to the Cuban elderly population, that is 12% of the Cuban population, because one of the characteristics of Cuba that is that we have a very low growth of the population, on the contrary on the rest of Latin America. But we didn't do that because we consider that is not fair, is not the right thing to do, to cut the support, the financial support, the healthcare assistance that the elderly people must have in their ages. And that is the way that we approach. But the answer of your question is the economy is our most important concern.
The question is, why was it absolutely necessary to shoot down the aircraft that penetrated Cuban airspace?
Well, first, it was an unfortunate incident. Let me start for this. It was a very unfortunate incident. But you have to know the history of this incident, that was the number of provocations that were developed against Cuba, the violation of the Cuban airspace for this group, and also the way that we are trying to avoid this kind of provocation. Precisely, for many years, we suffered many attacks from different terrorist groups who are based here in the United States. Only this year, the U.S. government oppressed two different groups who had terrorist plans against Cuba, and were the U.S. authorities, and we are very thankful for that action, who discover and from judicial point of view, are taken to the different courts, these two groups, one in San Diego, California, and the second in Miami. That is something that we have to consider, that we are in certain way for those groups on their sea. Second, there was, during this year, a number of violations of the Cuban airspace, including 2 in January, that these planes fly over Havana, our capital, and drop leaflets against our government. You must consider that. And precisely that day that occurred, that violation of the Cuban airspace, for the first time in 8 years, precisely for the recovery of the Cuban economy, we were celebrating the first day of the Carnival. Again, because for almost 8 years we didn't celebrate the Carnival. And that was that day, that Saturday afternoon, we were celebrating the Carnival. And were hundreds of thousands of Cubans, more or less 500,000 Cubans, on the street, particular in this waterfront, that is the area where we celebrate those holidays. Precisely at that moment, we warned to the pilots that don't go there, that they must stop the flight. They say that they knew what they were doing, but they will continue. And happened that unfortunate incident, as I said at the beginning. On the other hand, many times through different ways, we contact the U.S. authorities to try to stop the flights. And we received an official answer from the American government that they were stopping the flights. In fact, after the last violation in January was the 13th of January, and this incident, the 24th of February, any flight took place. We thought that was the measures of the United States with the work who stopped the flights. But and we understood in that way. But unfortunately, they repeat the flights, and you know that the license of the pilot who was in that group that day, 24th of February, was withdrawn by the U.S. authorities, and we think that it shows very clearly that this group was violating not only international law, not only the Cuban airspace, also the American law. Nevertheless, was an unfortunate incident.
What sort of businesses are being set up by foreign investors in Cuba?
Well, according to the last legislation that we approved, the last foreign investment law, all the Cuban sectors are open to the economy, but not all are receiving the same amount of investment. The most important sectors of the Cuban economy that are receiving the investments are tourism, nickel, mining, agriculture, citrus, textile, communications. They are the most important, but all the Cuban economy is open precisely to receive the foreign investment. Thank you.
Would you comment on the sugar industry and particularly the state of the mills and where supporting capital is coming from?
Mm-hmm. Well, now we have more than 140 mills of sugar. It is the first economic sector in Cuba. It was the first economic sector until last year. That tourism was the first in the Cuban history, not in the history after the triumph of the revolution. Last year we had a very bad crop, a very bad harvest, only 3.3 million tons. The average production in our best years was between 6 and 7. The average in the Cuban history is between 4.5 and 5.5. Was very bad harvest because we were lack of fertilizers and different materials that we need to carry on the sugar harvest. But this year, fortunately, considering all the transformation, all the efforts that we already done in the sugar industry, as I said in my presentation, we reached 4.3 million tons last weekend, and we expect maybe 100,000 more tons for this crop. The capitals we are receiving from all over the world, mainly from Western Europe, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, UK, and we are working very hard to recover the level of production that we had before decreasing that we lost during the last years. Nevertheless, also we are trying to improve the other sectors of the economy because we consider that it's very important to have a more diversified economy according to the new world, to the new international situation that everybody have now.
Are there any succession plans for after Mr. Castro?
Well, first, I'm sure that we must elect a new president. That is something that we have to do it. But in a way that's Cuba is under many changes, many transformations, and will continue that path, like the rest of the world. There is not choice. But the most important thing, as I said, I think that several times here this afternoon, for the Cuban people is our independence, our sovereignty. Excuse me if I repeat this point, but it's the key of the Cuban situation, the right of the Cuban people to independence. The revolution was for the first time the real chance that we had to be independent. Now, maybe we're the more independent country in the world after the disintegration of the socialist bloc. And it is our goal to preserve that independence. We think that this goal, this purpose, don't have any contradiction to have a normal and very good relation with the rest of the world. That we think that it's perfectly normal that each country have the right to decide by themselves the political system that they want. And in the future will be other Cubans. And we are sure that in a different way, will be in a different way. We don't have any doubt of this. In the future will be in a different way, like in the rest of the world. But in a different way, we are sure that the future generation of Cubans will defend the sovereignty and independence of Cuba like we are trying to do now.
What is the extent of freedom of the press in Cuba?
According to your standards, it's very low, is the truth. We have our system, we have our interpretation. We don't have censorship. It's something that is very difficult to understand when we explain this. The people don't believe we don't have censorship in Cuba. Each newspaper, each magazine, each TV station have their own system, and their journalists publicize what they want. But of course, the journalists who work in those newspapers are those who have, nevertheless, that they have many different points of view in many different things. Regarding the revolution, they have more or less the same opinion. It is our system, it is our way. I think that in the future, that is something that maybe will be modified. I don't see anything against to modify this. But it's the same of the question regards the election of these things. It's not easy when your country is suffering so many aggressions, so many even attacks, hostile attitude against your country, particularly when it comes from the most powerful country, like United States. It's not easy to take some kind of measures. Now I'm sure that the day that we'll have a normal relation, many things will be different.
The observation was that upon travel, there are many wonderful things in Cuba, and the question was, why does the United States, to such a degree, have an aversion to the government of Cuba, in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, thank you very much for your statement. Second, well, it's a very important question, particularly when you see the relations that the United States have with other countries with the same political system that we have. When you see that the United States have a different relation with a country who was in war, like in Asia, where only a few years ago, 58,000 Americans died in that war. And when you see the kind of relation that for many years, even during the Cold War, the United States have with many different countries with a different political system, like, for example, the kingdoms of Middle East and so many things. It's a very good question. Why? Why Cuba? I think that it's the American people who must answer that question. Because we are neighbors. Nobody could change that. We don't want to change that. That is one of the paradoxes of the situation. I don't know if, while you were in Cuba, some of you have been there during the last years. The Cuban people don't have any kind of hostile attitude against Americans. On the contrary. In many sense, we are very being influenced, receive a very important influence from the United States. Not all in good things, by the way. But in movies, music, sports, as I said at the beginning, with Cubans, we love baseball. It's our most important sport. It's the only one sport team in our opinion. And we think that we could have a normal relation like we have with the rest of the world. For that reason, I think that it's the American people who must answer and who must solve that problem. Maybe it is related with what is going to be happening the second Tuesday in November here in the United States, for that reason.
The observation was made that President Clinton would like to normalize relations with Cuba, but he's hesitant to do so because of the election. The question is, what do you think President Clinton, if reelected, will do?
Well, I prefer to answer our position. We always say that we have the willingness to have a normal relation with the United States. We could set many preconditions related with the embargo, with the damage of the embargo against Cuba, with the occupation of part of the Cuban territory, because Cuba is the only country of the world who one part of our territory is occupied by military forces against our will. It's Guantanamo Bay. It's the only country in the world with that particular situation. We could have many claims, many complaints, but in a way, to have a normal relations, we have put all the things in one side, and we think that we could have, as I said before a normal relation, and it is the Cuban position to have a normal relation with the United States. And we want to do it, and we are optimistic. That is one of our problems. We are optimistic in this world. It's not easy to be optimistic, but we are optimistic, and we think and we are sure that someday we'll have normal relations with the United States.
Yeah, the observation was made that many of the steps you took to turn around your economy recently have been market reform type steps. And the question is, how does that relate to the fact that Mr. Castro has recently reaffirmed his Marxism-Leninism?
Well, thank you. It's not only him, it's many of us who say that. But precisely, as I said, we are in a different world, complete different world than the world that we had during the so-called Cold War. I say so-called because for Cuba it's always is still a Cold War that we are facing. But it's very clear that we have to introduce many changes, many transformations in the economy. Not choice. We have to improve the economy. We want to change the economy in a way to have a more efficient, more productive, more competitive economy. You could call market orientation capitalist. I could call socialist. Why socialists have to be in contradiction with a better economy? And of course, we should consider different alternatives. For that reason, during the last 2 years, as I said in my words, 200,000 Cubans have their own business, and there are more than 200,000 who are in that way now. We are only looking for that they should have their own license in a way that they should pay their taxes, as I said. But for one hand, we want to improve the economy in that direction. But on the other, we want to preserve, we want to maintain all the social achievements that we already have. Because for our point of view, there is no sense to improve the economy for one side and in the other to lose the social achievements that you already have. Precisely, we are trying to follow a path, a track that is not easy. On the contrary, it's very difficult to try to improve the economy, but on the other hand, to preserve these social achievements that we already have, and try even to improve it, because they are not perfect. There's many things that we have to improve. For our point of view, there is no contradiction with that track, with that path, to our goals to have a society based in social justice against all kinds of discrimination, sexual, racial discrimination, a society with will have equality of opportunities, and everybody should have the right to do by themselves the best and to give one contribution to the society. Of course, in many ways, it is an experiment, like many other social experiments that we are seeing during the history of the world. But that is our goal. We are trying to do. And we expect that nevertheless, all the problems that we are facing, all the future problems that we must face, I'm sure that we'll have many problems, we will prevail in that direction in a way to try to increase the standard of living of the Cuban people, that it is our ultimate goal.
The question is, what is the link between that and the embargo, in your view?
Well, of course, there is a link, no doubt, because precisely the purpose of the embargo is to try to make a big damage against the Cuban economy. And that problem that you said, that was epidemic that we had during 1992 and 1994, it is solved now. It's not 100% solved, but in 95% of the cases are solved now, because we imported from the former Soviet Union almost half of our food, of our food needs we imported. Because one of the problems that we had in the development of our economy is that the Cuban agriculture was not so efficient that we needed, particularly in the production of food. For example, we have a concentration of the population in the cities. Cuba not have the same pattern as the rest of Latin America. we have the 80% of the population in urban areas and only 20% in rural areas. And this 20%, even they don't want to work in agriculture because the agriculture is a very hard work, very hard job, very sacrificed job in tropical countries, particularly in Cuba. Precisely for that, we are introducing all these transformations. We increased the production of food last year 30%, as I expressed. It is not enough. We have to continue. But we, according to the Cuban healthcare system, we took a whole plan of measures in try to solve that epidemic that you said. And fortunately, in 1994, we started to solve that problem, and we have a different opinion, a different situation. But as you said, there is a very close link, very clear link between the embargo and this problem that we had.
With very deep apologies, especially to Ms. Schuford and you, sir, and you who have had your hands up for a long time, and a number of others, we must yield to the only tyrant which we recognize here, and that is time. And we must end this session. But, Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for an all too short and very enjoyable evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.